Well, it was the time when, for some number of years, about that time when the Washington Post would...
In 1994, a man walked out of his job on Wall Street, loaded everything he owned into the back of a car, and drove across America with no real plan. His wife drove. He sat in the passenger seat writing a business plan on a laptop. They were heading to Seattle to start an online bookstore that almost everyone around them thought was a terrible idea. Jeff Bezos was 30 years old. He had given up a stable, well-paying career, and the company he was about to build had a roughly 70% chance of failing. By his own estimate, we know how that story ended, but what most people don't know is that Bezos' willingness to walk away from security wasn't unusual among the world's most successful people. In fact, it was almost predictable because the billionaires with the most extraordinary stories aren't the ones who started with advantages. They're the ones who started with almost nothing and refused to let that define them. In the next 10 minutes, we're going to look at 5 of those stories. 5 people who grew up in poverty, relied on government assistance, slept in cars, or arrived in a new country with nothing. And 5 decisions that changed everything.
Folks, it's about a guy named Jan, and it begins when he was 16, growing up in a rural village outside of Kiev, Ukraine.
Let's start with the most unlikely tech founder in history. Jan Koum arrived in the United States from Ukraine at 16 years old. He and his mother moved into a small apartment in California, and for a period of time they relied on food stamps to survive. His mother worked as a babysitter. Koum cleaned grocery stores, but in the evenings, after work, he taught himself computer networking, not in a classroom, not with a tutor, but alone, reading technical manuals he could barely afford. That obsessive self-education eventually got him into Silicon Valley. Years later, he co-founded WhatsApp. In 2014, Facebook acquired WhatsApp for approximately $19 billion. The teenager who once stood in a government assistance line had just built one of the most valuable communication platforms on Earth. And he signed the acquisition paperwork on the wall of the social services office where he and his mother had collected food stamps, deliberately as a reminder of where he had come from. That detail tells you something essential about what drives people like Koum. It wasn't the money. It was the proof. The second story starts in a public housing complex in Brooklyn. Howard Schultz grew up watching his father work a series of low-wage jobs, none of which came with healthcare, job security, or any real financial cushion. When his father suffered a work injury, the family had nothing to fall back on. No safety net, just uncertainty. That image, his father, hurt with no support, never left him. Years later, after joining a small Seattle coffee company called Starbucks and eventually buying it, Schultz made decisions that baffled other executives. He extended healthcare benefits to part-time employees. He created stock ownership programs for frontline workers. Wall Street questioned the economics. Schultz held firm.
There's 1,500 Italian coffee bars in Milan alone, and I'm watching the ritual of coffee, the sense of community.
His argument was simple. A company that treats its people well builds loyalty that can't be purchased through advertising. And the results, over the decades that followed, proved him right. Starbucks grew from a regional coffee shop into a global brand with tens of thousands of locations worldwide. But the policy that defined Schultz as a leader wasn't born in a business school. It was born in a Brooklyn apartment, watching his father come home injured with nowhere to turn. The third story involves a man who, at a specific point in his life, was living out of his car. Paul DeJoria has spoken openly about periods of genuine financial crisis, including stretches where he had no permanent home and was raising a young child. He sold encyclopedias door to door, collected bottles for money.
I want to tell you how America still works and maybe give you some tips on how to start a variety of businesses with little to no money.
And by his own account, understood what it felt like when people didn't answer the door. That experience changed how he thought about rejection. Most people fear rejection because each refusal feels like evidence that they're wrong. DeJoria reframed it. Rejection was simply part of the process. Most doors wouldn't open, but some would. And the people who succeeded were the ones who kept knocking. In 1980, with a loan of $700, he co-founded John Paul Mitchell Systems, selling professional hair care products door to door, the same way he had sold encyclopedias. Years later, he co-founded Patron Spirits, helping transform premium tequila into a luxury category. Both companies became globally recognized brands. The man who once lived in his car built 2 of them. The fourth story begins not in a housing project or a refugee apartment, but in an orphanage in Milan.
He was hired by a metal factory run by Johnson. There, I worked for 3.5 years as an apprentice to 8 engravers, also being an apprentice.
Leonardo Del Vecchio's father died before he was born. His mother, unable to support the family financially, placed him in an orphanage when he was 7 years old. He stayed there for years. As a teenager, he found work as an apprentice making molds and metal components, the kind of skilled, precise, physical work that most people consider a dead end. Del Vecchio saw it differently. In 1961, using skills he had developed as a young apprentice, he founded a small eyewear company in northern Italy called Luxottica. Over the following decades, Luxottica grew into the largest eyewear company in the world, manufacturing and distributing brands worn by hundreds of millions of people globally, including Ray-Ban, Oakley, and lenses for Chanel, Prada, and Giorgio Armani. The child who grew up in an orphanage died in 2022 as one of the wealthiest people in Europe. The fifth story is perhaps the most remarkable of all. Li Ka-shing was born in China. When war forced his family to flee to Hong Kong, they arrived with almost nothing. His father became ill and passed away, leaving Li a teenager. As the primary means of support for his mother and younger siblings, he left school. He had no choice. Li found work at a plastics factory, working extraordinarily long hours for very little pay.
我真係好幸運。第一，我細個我喜歡讀書。
But he studied the factory's operations obsessively. He watched how materials moved, how costs were managed, how small efficiencies compounded over time. Eventually, he started his own business, manufacturing plastic flowers, of all things, and sold them internationally at a time when Hong Kong's manufacturing sector was growing rapidly. That company became the foundation for CK Hutchison Holdings. Today, a global conglomerate with operations in ports, retail telecommunications, infrastructure, and energy across more than 50 countries, the teenager who left school to support his family became one of the most influential entrepreneurs in Asian history. So what do these 5 people actually have in common? They weren't born into the same circumstances. They built completely different things. They operated in different industries, different countries, different eras. But when you look at the moments that defined each of them, the food stamps, the orphanage, the car, the factory floor, the door-to-door sales pitch, a pattern becomes clear. None of them waited for their circumstances to change before they started moving. Koum taught himself networking while working a cleaning job. Schultz carried his father's injury into every leadership decision he made. DeJoria reframed rejection as process. Del Vecchio turned apprenticeship into ownership. Li turned factory work into industrial knowledge. They all converted their disadvantages into something useful, not by ignoring where they started, by using it. That's the real lesson here. Not that hardship guarantees success. It doesn't. Not that anyone who works hard enough will become a billionaire. Most won't. But that extraordinary starting points are rarely what determine extraordinary outcomes. More often, it's the decision made quietly, without applause, usually when no one is watching, to keep moving anyway. Which of these 5 stories hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments and tell me why. Subscribe to Starscope, because next we're going inside the world's most expensive billionaire possessions. And some of the price tags will genuinely surprise you,